So, in what can only be described as an absolutely stunning move, the Treasury Department has just frozen the Trump family trusts, effectively locking down what sources estimate to be billions in generational wealth. We're talking about trust funds that have been structured for decades to pass wealth to Trump's children and grandchildren, now completely inaccessible. This isn't some routine audit or paperwork delay. Federal authorities have invoked emergency powers typically reserved for drug cartels and terrorist financing operations. It's honestly hard to believe they're using those same mechanisms against a former president's family assets. But here we are. This isn't just about Trump's personal finances anymore. We're talking about a move that reaches into the heart of how wealthy families in America protect and transfer their assets across generations. And trust me, this is sending shockwaves through every estate planning office from Manhattan to Mar-a-Lago, because if it can happen to Trump, every wealthy family in America is suddenly wondering if their own trusts are vulnerable. Let me fill you in on what's been happening behind the scenes. So here's the scoop on how we got to this unprecedented moment. Donald Trump has spent his entire life building what he's called an empire, a network of businesses, properties, and most importantly, trusts designed to shield family wealth from taxes, creditors, and legal judgments. These aren't just simple bank accounts. We're talking about sophisticated financial structures set up by some of the most expensive estate planning attorneys in New York. The Trump family trusts were established going back to the 1990s, with major restructuring happening around 2016 when Trump entered politics. According to financial documents reviewed by the New York Times back in 2018, these trusts held everything from real estate holdings to licensing deals to cash reserves, all carefully structured to minimize tax exposure and maximize wealth preservation for the next generation. Whether it was the Trump Organization's various holdings, the Mar-a-Lago property, golf courses across the country, or international branding deals, assets were funneled through these trusts. Trump really cemented himself as someone who understood how to use America's tax code and trust laws to his advantage, always staying just inside the legal boundaries while maximizing every possible benefit. But here's where things get interesting. We're now 3 weeks into a Treasury Department investigation that most people didn't even know was happening. Federal prosecutors have been quietly building a case, and sources tell Politico that this investigation has been running parallel to all the other legal cases Trump's been fighting. While everyone was focused on the classified documents case, the January 6th prosecutions, and the New York civil fraud trial, Treasury investigators were following the money. And what they found, according to reports from October 29th, led them to take this extraordinary step. Trust funds holding assets for Donald Trump Jr., Eric Trump, Ivanka Trump, and even Trump's grandchildren have been frozen. Bank accounts connected to these trusts can't be accessed. Real estate held in trust can't be sold or refinanced. Even distributions that were scheduled to go out to family members have been stopped cold. This mess is unfolding because Treasury Department officials claim they've uncovered evidence of what they're calling potential money laundering and sanctions violations connected to how assets were moved into these trusts and where some of the funding originally came from. And guess who's stuck right in the middle? The entire Trump family, facing the prospect of losing access to their generational wealth. They're supposed to be protected by decades of legal precedent around trust law and family wealth transfers. But here's the kicker. The Treasury Department isn't interested in traditional legal boundaries when they believe they're dealing with national security concerns. They want full transparency into every dollar that went into these trusts, where it came from, and whether any of it violated sanctions against foreign entities or represented the proceeds of illegal activity. And before we go any further, let's be real for a second. Whether you support Trump or oppose him, the idea that the federal government can freeze family trusts without a trial, without a conviction, just based on an ongoing investigation, that should give every American pause. Because the precedent this sets reaches far beyond one family. Now back to the matter at hand. Reports from around October 27th revealed just how aggressively the Treasury Department has been pursuing this investigation. According to MSNBC's reporting, Treasury officials described the Trump family financial network as exhibiting patterns consistent with sophisticated money laundering operations, and even went as far as to say that certain transactions showed deliberate attempts to obscure the origins of substantial foreign payments. Talk about strong words. Essentially, Treasury investigators are calling the Trump family operation a laundering scheme for not being fully transparent about where certain large deposits came from over the years. And this wasn't a private investigation quietly conducted behind closed doors. The Treasury Department made sure to file the freeze orders publicly in federal court, making it clear that they were taking aggressive action and that the Trump family was under serious financial scrutiny. This announcement sent shockwaves through the financial and legal communities because it raised all sorts of questions. If the Treasury Department, working in conjunction with the Justice Department's Asset Forfeiture Division, could freeze a former president's family trusts without criminal charges even being filed yet. What did that mean for everyone else trying to understand the limits of government power? Now, this isn't the first time we've seen Trump face financial consequences for his actions. Trump's financial dealings have been under investigation pretty much continuously since he entered politics back in 2015. Whether it was the Trump Organization's tax practices, his charitable foundation's misuse of funds, or questions about foreign money flowing into his properties, financial scrutiny has been a constant. Just think about how the Trump Foundation was shut down by the New York Attorney General back in 2018 after it was found to have illegally coordinated with Trump's presidential campaign and misused charitable funds. Trump and his children were forced to pay $2 million in damages, and the foundation was dissolved. That was supposed to be a warning about mixing family finances with political operations. Then there was the New York civil fraud case earlier this year. Judge Arthur Engoron found that Trump had fraudulently inflated his net worth by billions of dollars on financial statements, lying to banks and insurers to get better loan terms and lower insurance rates. Trump was ordered to pay over $450 million in penalties, and his ability to do business in New York was severely restricted. That wasn't just a slap on the wrist. That was a judge finding that Trump had engaged in persistent fraud over decades. And let's not forget how Deutsche Bank, one of the few major banks that would still lend to Trump after his multiple bankruptcies, ended up cooperating with federal investigators. According to reports from CBS, Deutsche Bank turned over years of financial records showing loans to Trump that were based on those same fraudulent financial statements. The bank itself faced scrutiny for continuing to do business with Trump, even when internal compliance officers raised red flags. Even the IRS has been investigating Trump's tax returns, particularly a questionable $72 million refund he claimed and received. That audit has been ongoing for years, with experts saying the claimed refund appeared to be based on dubious grounds. Now, it looks like the Treasury Department's current action against the family trusts is pulling all these threads together. This pattern is becoming all too familiar. You can structure your finances in the most complicated ways possible, use every tool available to wealthy families, and deploy armies of lawyers and accountants to make it all look legitimate. But the moment serious federal investigators start pulling on those threads, the whole elaborate structure starts to unravel. So, what did the Trump family do to trigger this extraordinary Treasury Department action? Well, it all boils down to how certain large payments from foreign sources made their way into the family trusts over the past decade, particularly during Trump's presidency and immediately after. The financial freeze happened because Treasury investigators claim they identified multiple wire transfers totaling hundreds of millions of dollars from entities in countries that either had active U.S. sanctions at the time or that raised serious questions about sanctions evasion. While the Trump family maintained these were legitimate business transactions, payments for licensing deals, real estate projects, or consulting services, investigators are arguing these transactions were structured specifically to obscure their origins and avoid triggering automatic reporting requirements. Ultimately, the assets got frozen because Treasury couldn't verify the legitimacy of the funding sources and couldn't rule out that some of this money violated sanctions laws or represented the proceeds of corrupt foreign officials parking their wealth in U.S. real estate. As people managing these trusts, the Trump family attorneys decided to take a very aggressive stance. They filed immediate legal challenges, arguing that the Treasury Department was overstepping its authority and refused to provide the detailed documentation investigators were demanding. Their approach seemed to be standard wealthy family playbook: assert attorney-client privilege wherever possible, claim that business records are proprietary, fight every subpoena, and force the government to prove its case in court rather than cooperating voluntarily. At first, this seemed like a reasonable legal strategy. Wealthy families have significant rights to privacy in their financial dealings. You don't have to voluntarily hand over every record just because investigators ask. Force them to get proper court orders. Make them prove they have legitimate grounds for each request. But as the investigation dragged into its third week, some serious issues started cropping up. Foreign banks that had processed some of these transactions were refusing to provide complete records, citing their own country's banking secrecy laws. Shell companies that appeared in the transaction chains were registered in jurisdictions known for financial opacity. And some of the business deals that supposedly justified these large payments looked, upon closer examination, like they never actually produced any real business activity. While Trump family attorneys were fighting hard and maintaining their position that all transactions were legitimate, predictably, the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network began to see a pattern that looked more and more like money laundering. Documents reviewed by investigators, according to Politico's reporting from October 28th, showed that millions of dollars flowed through a complex web of LLCs and trusts, with each layer making it harder to trace the original source. This was the moment Treasury officials began to worry that while they were fighting legal battles over document production, assets might be moved or put beyond reach. You see, Treasury Department investigators value their ability to follow money trails, to freeze assets before they disappear offshore, and overall to protect the U.S. financial system from being used for money laundering. They don't want to spend years building a case only to find that all the assets have been transferred to accounts in countries with no extradition treaties. That's definitely not an outcome that serves justice or financial system integrity. And then Trump's legal team went ahead and made a move that, according to Treasury officials, was a serious red flag. The Trump family attorneys started looking for ways to restructure certain trusts and figured they should move some assets into new entities with different ownership structures. They even considered transferring certain properties and funds to offshore trusts in jurisdictions like the Cook Islands or Nevis, places known for their asset protection laws that make it nearly impossible for U.S. authorities to reach assets once they're transferred. But then, when Treasury investigators caught wind of this through their monitoring of financial transactions, they absolutely lost it. In Treasury's eyes, trying to restructure and move assets while under investigation is exactly what people do when they're trying to hide something. Attempting to shift wealth to offshore jurisdictions that don't cooperate with U.S. legal processes? That's pure consciousness of guilt. Any family that's confident in the legitimacy of their wealth doesn't suddenly start moving it to the Cook Islands when investigators come asking questions. Now, this left the Trump family in a really tight spot. On one side, they really need to maintain control of these assets to fund their ongoing legal battles. The Trump family is facing hundreds of millions in legal judgments and fees, and without access to trust funds, they'll struggle to pay lawyers, post bonds, and cover the massive penalties from the New York fraud case. If Treasury locks down the trusts, the financial pressure becomes crushing. On the flip side, they actually have to deal with legitimate questions about where certain large payments came from and whether all their business dealings were legal. That means providing detailed documentation, explaining complex transactions, and potentially revealing business relationships they'd prefer to keep private. The tricky part is all of that requires a level of transparency and cooperation that the Trump family has spent decades avoiding. Everything about how they structure their finances is designed to minimize disclosure and maximize privacy. So the Trump family is caught in a bind. They can either keep fighting Treasury and refusing to provide full documentation, which means the assets stay frozen indefinitely, and that only makes them look more guilty and puts enormous financial strain on their ability to function, or they can fully cooperate with Treasury investigators, which means opening up decades of financial records, explaining every questionable transaction, and potentially revealing business relationships with foreign entities that could trigger additional legal problems or political scandals. It's honestly hard to believe we're watching this play out. And that's the impossible situation Treasury has created for any family that tries to use complex financial structures to obscure the origins of their wealth. The government demands total transparency when they suspect wrongdoing, but the very act of structuring finances to minimize transparency is what triggers suspicion in the first place. They're not shy about using asset freezes whenever they think money might disappear, and they don't wait for convictions before they act. This whole scenario is causing major stress within the Trump family and their extended network of business associates and political allies. If Treasury has frozen Trump family trusts and is willing to publicly pursue a former president's wealth, every person who's ever done business with Trump or received payments from Trump-connected entities is left wondering if they're the next target. Those Trump Organization executives who signed off on questionable deals over the years, who processed payments from mysterious foreign entities, who helped structure transactions to minimize paper trails. They're all now worried sick about whether their own financial dealings will withstand scrutiny if investigators come knocking. Meanwhile, the Republican mega-donors who've been funding Trump's political operation believe Trump is being persecuted and that this is a politically motivated attack on a wealthy conservative family. But some of them are also sophisticated business people who understand that legitimate businesses don't typically structure their finances the way Trump has, and they're questioning whether continuing to support him financially makes sense when his own family trusts are frozen for potential money laundering. Things became even more intense when Robert Wolf, the former CEO of UBS Americas and a major Democratic donor, but also someone with deep Wall Street credibility, broke ranks from typical political commentary. According to an appearance on MSNBC on October 30th, Wolf stated that based on what he's seeing in the Treasury Department's court filings, these transaction patterns are exactly what compliance officers are trained to flag as high-risk money laundering indicators, and any major bank would have filed suspicious activity reports on these transfers. He had been pushing for complete financial transparency for years and criticized the Trump family for treating U.S. trust law like a personal secrecy shield rather than a legitimate estate planning tool. When someone as aligned with the financial establishment as Robert Wolf starts using terms like high-risk money laundering indicators to describe a former president's family finances, you know the situation is serious. This isn't a partisan political attack. This is a serious financial professional saying that what he sees in these court documents looks like the kind of activity that gets accounts frozen and investigated. The Treasury Department decided to take aggressive legal action. On October 26th, according to court filings reviewed by CBS News, the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control filed emergency freeze orders in federal district court in Washington, D.C., stating that the Trump family trusts exhibited substantial risk of sanctions violations and potential money laundering activity requiring immediate asset preservation. The legal documents were remarkably detailed. They pointed out that between 2017 and 2021, during Trump's presidency, the family trusts received wire transfers totaling over $300 million from entities with connections to individuals on the U.S. sanctions list. They identified specific transactions involving payments from entities connected to Russian oligarchs, Saudi business interests, and Turkish financial networks, all of which raised questions about whether sanctions were being evaded through the use of intermediary companies. They noted that many of these payments were structured just under the $10,000 reporting threshold or were broken into multiple smaller transactions in patterns that suggested deliberate avoidance of automatic reporting requirements. The court filing stated that Trump family attorneys had failed to provide satisfactory documentation regarding the legitimate business purposes for these substantial foreign payments, and that attempts to restructure trusts during the investigation demonstrated consciousness of wrongdoing and flight risk. The Treasury Department wasn't asking for permission. They were notifying the court that they had already frozen the assets and were seeking judicial approval to maintain that freeze while the investigation continued. The legal process moved pretty quickly, and the judge recognized the urgency. After all, every day that passes without asset protection is another opportunity for sophisticated actors to move wealth beyond the reach of U.S. authorities. And let me tell you, the judge didn't hold back with the preliminary ruling. It was a major development for the Trump family. Federal Judge Tanya Chutkan, who's presided over several January 6th cases and has shown she's not intimidated by political pressure, issued an order on October 29th stating that the Treasury Department had presented substantial evidence of suspicious financial activity that warrants asset preservation pending full investigation. That's legal speak for saying, the government has shown me enough to justify this freeze. The patterns they've documented are concerning enough that we can't risk these assets disappearing while we sort this out. There's sufficient evidence of potential violations to warrant this extraordinary measure. So it looks like the Trump family's legal battle hit a significant roadblock, and not just any roadblock. A federal judge effectively validated Treasury's authority to freeze these assets without waiting for criminal charges. The family can still fight this in court, but the immediate emergency freeze stands. They've lost the first round, and the assets remain frozen for now. To make matters even more difficult, the judge ruled that the Trump family must provide complete financial documentation within 30 days or face additional sanctions, including potential findings of contempt. Now, why is this such a big deal? Well, according to legal experts interviewed by Politico on October 30th, Judge Chutkan's ruling was seen as giving Treasury Department unusual latitude. The judge essentially said that when national security and sanctions enforcement are at stake, the government can freeze assets first and sort out the details later, which represents a significant expansion of Treasury's authority to act before proving violations in court. This wasn't just about preventing the Trump family from accessing money. It was about establishing that Treasury has broad powers to lock down assets when they suspect sanctions, violations, or money laundering, even against politically prominent families. The judge's strong language about substantial evidence of suspicious activity will now be cited in future cases as precedent for aggressive asset freezes. Legal experts from both sides of the political spectrum are taking note. Andrew McCarthy, the former federal prosecutor and conservative legal commentator who's often defended Trump on procedural grounds, appeared on Fox News on November 1st and made a statement that really should catch everyone's attention. He said that if Treasury has documentation showing consistent patterns of large unexplained foreign payments into family trusts during Trump's presidency, that creates serious legal exposure, and the transaction structuring alone could support criminal charges, regardless of whether the underlying source of funds is ever fully proven. Now just think about that for a moment. Even a conservative legal voice who's generally sympathetic to Trump is saying that the patterns of financial activity documented in Treasury's court filings are legally indefensible. And this is coming from someone who appears regularly on Fox News defending Trump against what he views as politically motivated prosecutions. Barbara McQuaid, the former U.S. attorney and current University of Michigan law professor, mentioned that asset freezes of this magnitude against a former president's family are unprecedented, but the legal standard for such freezes is actually quite low. Treasury only needs to show probable cause of sanctions violations, not proof beyond reasonable doubt, which means these assets could remain frozen for years while litigation proceeds. When legal experts from both conservative and liberal perspectives start discussing the strength of Treasury's case and the low bar for maintaining these freezes, that's the moment to really pay attention. The fact that both McCarthy and McQuaid, despite their different political orientations, are agreeing that Treasury has sufficient grounds to maintain this freeze tells you this isn't about politics anymore. It's about whether the documented financial patterns can withstand legal scrutiny. So let's break down what this financial freeze could mean, because it's not just a dramatic legal story. It has serious consequences for how wealthy families operate, for Trump's political future, and for the balance of power between government enforcement agencies and private wealth. First up is the immediate political fallout. Trump is already facing significant backlash due to his multiple criminal indictments and civil judgments, and his ability to raise money for his 2024 campaign has been complicated by his legal troubles. Reports indicate that major Republican donors have been hesitant to contribute to someone who might be convicted or who might have their assets seized before the election even happens. The Treasury Department freezing his family trusts, that creates an entirely new level of financial vulnerability. And honestly, that's not a good look for someone running for president on a platform of business success and financial acumen. Most Americans respect success and wealth when they believe it was earned legitimately and through hard work and smart business decisions. But when federal investigators are publicly questioning where that wealth came from and whether it involves money laundering and sanctions violations, that's a completely different story. Democrats are definitely planning to take advantage of this situation. They'll argue that Trump believes he's above the law, that he views America's financial system as his personal playground, and they'll have federal court filings backing up those claims. This is going to be Exhibit A in proving that Trump's business empire was built on questionable foreign money and elaborate schemes to avoid scrutiny. You can expect to see quotes from Judge Chutkan's ruling and references to Treasury's investigation popping up in Democratic campaign ads, speeches, and debates. Now let's touch on what this means for family wealth protection more broadly. For decades, wealthy American families have used complex trust structures to protect their wealth from taxes, creditors, and legal judgments. Estate planning attorneys have built entire careers around creating sophisticated trust arrangements that provide maximum asset protection while minimizing disclosure requirements. These structures are legal. They're a normal part of how wealthy families manage generational wealth transfers. But by going after Trump family trusts with this level of aggression, Treasury is sending a message that these structures don't provide immunity from investigation. If the government believes you've used trusts to launder money or evade sanctions, they can crack those structures open, freeze the assets, and demand complete transparency, regardless of how many layers of LLCs and offshore entities you've created. This is making estate planning attorneys across the country nervous because it fundamentally changes the risk calculation. If trusts can be frozen based on Treasury suspicion alone, without criminal charges, without a trial, just based on investigative findings of suspicious activity, then the asset protection these structures supposedly provide is much weaker than families have been led to believe. The implications go far beyond Trump. Every wealthy family with complex international business dealings, with foreign clients or partners, with assets held in trusts, they're all suddenly wondering whether their own structures could trigger similar scrutiny. This situation shines a massive spotlight on the tension between privacy rights and law enforcement in the financial system. At the heart of the issue is whether Treasury can just freeze family trusts without criminal charges whenever they decide the transaction patterns look suspicious. If they get their way on that, it could totally change how financial enforcement operates in America. Our system was designed with the understanding that the government needs to prove wrongdoing before punishing people. You're innocent until proven guilty. The government has to get warrants before searching your property. They have to show probable cause. They can't just seize your assets because they have suspicions. But in the financial realm, especially when national security and sanctions enforcement are involved, those protections have been eroding. Civil asset forfeiture laws already allow police to seize property without criminal convictions if they believe it's connected to crimes. Treasury regulations allow the freezing of assets suspected of terrorism financing or sanctions violations without having to prove anything in court first. The investigation itself is enough justification. What we're seeing with the Trump family trusts is these powers being used against a politically prominent American family in ways that raise serious questions about due process and the scope of government authority. The danger here is obvious. If Treasury can freeze a former president's family wealth based on investigative findings without trial, they can do it to anyone. The threshold for suspicious activity becomes whatever investigators decide it is. The ability of wealthy families to protect assets becomes dependent on whether they stay in the government's good graces. So the implications of this case reach far beyond just Trump and Treasury. It's about shaping the relationship between government enforcement power and private wealth for many years to come. Each time a government agency pushes the boundaries of its authority, uses emergency powers in questionable circumstances, or acts against politically prominent individuals in ways that look selective, it erodes trust in institutions. It starts making behavior that used to raise red flags feel normal. Think about it. If Treasury can freeze Trump family trusts for suspicious transaction patterns, what's to stop them from doing the same to political opponents in the future? If they can act based on investigative suspicions alone, without having to prove criminal activity first, what's to prevent politically motivated asset freezes against anyone who becomes inconvenient to whoever controls the Treasury Department? These actions don't just disappear when Trump is no longer in the headlines. They become precedent. They become the new normal. And that's pretty dangerous. Our financial system relies on predictable rules and consistent enforcement, assuming that people can structure their finances legally and won't face government seizure unless actual crimes are proven. When those assumptions crumble, confidence in the entire system starts to erode. Looking ahead to the 2024 election, it's clear that all of this is going to have some significant effects. We're still 11 months out from that election, but the narrative being set now is bound to influence how things unfold. If the story playing out is one of Trump fighting Treasury, fighting the Justice Department, fighting civil judgments, all while his family wealth is frozen and under investigation, that spells trouble for his campaign. Voters usually don't reward candidates whose personal finances are under federal investigation. They want someone who can focus on governing, not someone who's fighting to keep their assets from being seized. Right now, Trump isn't offering that stability. His entire focus is on his legal battles, on attacking the investigators, on claiming persecution. So expect Democrats to champion a message focused on restoring integrity to the White House and ensuring presidents work for the American people, not to enrich their families. After years of Trump using the presidency to benefit his business interests, facing investigations into his family trusts, there are voters who believe that if you vote Democratic, conflicts of interest and financial corruption investigations will stop being daily news. They're promising no more constant scandals about where the president's money came from or whether his family is profiting from foreign governments, just normal governance with clear financial boundaries. That message might just hit home for a lot of voters, including some moderate Republicans who are exhausted by the constant chaos and controversy surrounding Trump's finances. The business community, which has traditionally supported Republican candidates, is particularly uncomfortable with the Treasury Department action. Wall Street executives, corporate CEOs, and major business owners all rely on trust structures to protect their own wealth. Seeing those structures penetrated by federal investigators in such an aggressive way makes them nervous, regardless of what they think about Trump politically. Some business leaders are quietly expressing concern that Treasury is overreaching and setting dangerous precedents that could affect legitimate wealth protection strategies. Others are saying that if Trump's finances were legitimately suspicious, then Treasury is just doing its job regardless of the political implications. This split within the business community could have major implications for campaign funding and corporate support in 2024. So, here's the deal. The Treasury Department has frozen Trump family trusts worth an estimated billions of dollars, citing suspicious foreign transaction patterns and potential sanctions violations. This isn't just about Trump's financial troubles. It's about whether our system still maintains meaningful boundaries between government enforcement power and private wealth. If Treasury succeeds in maintaining these freezes indefinitely based on investigative suspicions alone, then we're basically saying that financial privacy and asset protection don't matter anymore if the government decides you look suspicious. That would mean we're stepping into a completely new realm where Treasury Department officials can effectively punish wealthy individuals by freezing their assets without ever having to prove criminal activity in court. It's about so much more than just whether Trump's money came from legitimate sources. It's about whether we genuinely have a financial system where legal rights and due process protections mean something, or if we're just stuck with whoever can convince a judge that transaction patterns look suspicious enough to justify freezing everything. The uncertainty is enormous. Trump's attorneys are promising to fight this freeze all the way to the Supreme Court if necessary. They're arguing that Treasury has violated due process, exceeded its statutory authority, and engaged in selective enforcement for political purposes. Those are serious legal arguments that might resonate with judges who are concerned about government overreach. But Treasury has strong grounds too. They have court filings documenting specific transactions that appear to violate sanctions laws. They have expert testimony explaining why these payment patterns are consistent with money laundering. They have the Trump family's own reluctance to provide complete documentation as evidence of consciousness of guilt. So keep an eye on this because things are just heating up. The legal battle over these trust freezes is going to take months, if not years, to fully resolve. And while it plays out, the Trump family remains locked out of billions in assets, unable to access funds they believe are rightfully theirs, while Treasury investigators continue following money trails that may lead to criminal charges. The next few months are going to be crucial. We're watching a test case that will determine the boundaries of government power over private wealth, the effectiveness of asset protection strategies that wealthy families have relied on for decades, and whether political prominence provides any shield against aggressive financial enforcement. The stakes have never been higher, the implications broader, and the outcome more unpredictable. This is just the beginning of what could be the most significant legal battle over family wealth and government enforcement power in modern American history.